Adventures in Mortuary Archaeology and Commemoration. It's Archaeo Death.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome everybody to my Archaeo Death Wednesday Live here from Archaeo Death Towers here in the exotic wilds of the Welsh landscape, coming to you across the world with archaeological news and fresh perspective. And I'm going to talk to you about a very exciting topic tonight. I'm going to be talking to you about what's new at Sutton Hoo. Now, for context, Sutton Hoo is perhaps one of the most famous early medieval archaeological digs ever in the universe. Excavated in 1938 and 1939, just on the brink of the Second World War, a team of archaeologists were parachuted in, not literally, to help an amateur archaeologist who had basically bitten off more than he could chew. With the permission of the landowner, Mrs. Edith Pretty, Basil Brown had started excavating what he'd thought at first was a Viking, but later proved to be an Anglo-Saxon ship burial, a 27-metre long ship, in the largest burial mound at Sutton Hoo, just south of Tranmere House on the east bank of the River Deben in Suffolk. And this was not the first Anglo-Saxon ship burial ever uncovered. There was a 19th century discovery at Snape nearby, but this discovery set the world alight in archaeological terms because it was the wealthiest, and is still the wealthiest, Anglo-Saxon burial ever found. A rich burial chamber full of not only elaborate high status objects, but objects that had unusual functions and meanings, all interred within the traces of a wooden chamber, and all of that constructed within a 27-metre long seagoing vessel, which may have been sail assisted but mainly a rowing vessel. A 27-metre long seagoing vessel, which may have been sail assisted but mainly a rowing vessel, to the British Museum, and they were put in an underground station with most of the other treasures, including the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, in a disused abandoned underground station to protect them from the Luftwaffe bombing, and were brought back to light in 1945 and analysed through the 50s, 60s and 70s. And the publication of this 1939 burial only came in the 1970s. Then there was excavations by in the 1960s. They went back to the site, I should have said. The British Museum went back and led excavations to understand more about the ship, but then the publications came in the 1970s on the back of that 1960s fieldwork. And then a new campaign of excavations took place in the 1980s and 1990s to put that Mound 1 ship burial and Mounds 2 and 3, which had been excavated by Basil Brown in 1938, into a broader context. And then, after those excavations were concluded, the National Trust took over the site, and ahead of the building of their visitor centre, more excavations took place on the next spur up, and a further range of archaeological excavations have been found. And if you want to see some more about how it's displayed today, you can watch my Sutton Hoo playlist. Remember playlists? I know people seem to struggle to find them, but I have a whole series of different playlists, and I have a Sutton Hoo playlist which you can watch on TikTok to get you an understanding of how the site is displayed today. So we've had a series of excavations that have helped to try and put this Mound 1 ship burial in its broader archaeological context. And the reason why it's captured the imagination is not simply because it's full of treasure, scare quotes, but also because it sheds light on the origins of Anglo-Saxon kingship at the very beginning of the 7th century, a time of late paganism and early Christian conversion, of conflict, of polity emergence, and of long-distance contacts between these Anglo-Saxons, not only Scandinavia, but the continent, the Mediterranean, and it sheds light on that world of early England before England, or the English Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before there was an England. And the finds are now displayed at the British Museum. They are the sort of centrepiece of the early medieval collections at the British Museum. This site is therefore famous. Right, and there's been a brand new publication on Sutton Hoo. There's been many publications over the years. I've even done publications about it. I've produced an article in book chapter in 2001, parts of my 2006 book, Death and Memory in Early Medieval Britain, and I also did a paper in 2011, as well as a very recent paper in 2022 about the interpretation of the find as treasure in popular terms, and I've critiqued that. So lots of archaeologists talk about Sutton Hoo, but this paper is a really interesting one, and it is sort of blowing things apart. It's giving us a new perspective. The cliche of shedding new light. This is not by a new scholar. This is by one of the more experienced and still extant and alive scholars who was participatory in the excavations in the 1960s. And so it's not a new voice, but it is a new perspective, because so much of the story of Sutton Hoo has been bound up with various very charismatic and vocal personalities who've written the story. And Valerie Fenwick is coming back to this study now and is re-evaluating the ship and the ship burial. So I thought it'd be a good idea as a TikTok live to, given how famous Sutton Hoo is as an archaeological discovery, it's the Tutankhamun of Britain. And ironically, one of the pieces of evidence vaguely alludes to Egypt, in the sense that we now have a new hint that maybe the body within the Mound 1 ship, the burial chamber in the Mound 1 ship, was mummified. Bam, bam, bam. How could this be? What do you mean mummified? That's ridiculous, Howard. The Anglo-Saxons weren't mummifying their dead. Au contraire, dear listener, au contraire. We are now having, and this reveals further light on the influence of and contacts of the Anglo-Saxons, not directly and exclusively with Egypt, but with the Eastern Mediterranean world. So let's get into it, shall we? I won't look at your comments, as usual with these lives. I welcome you. Please add comments and questions, and I will get back to them at the end. I'm not ignoring you, but I want to do in this first half a little exposition of this new publication, because I think that'll be of interest to folks, okay? I have moderators, so please be courteous to each other, and anybody here inclined to start going down a silly route on starting to cast insults because they didn't like my video about transgender burials, then please exit yourself from the live, because we don't want that here, okay? This is an inclusive space, so thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the cameras onto my laptop and show you the publication and go through the publication on the screen, which may be a bit boring, but you'll hear my voice, and in this way you'll get a little story. And I won't read it out word for word, but I'll start with the abstract, because that will be the best place to begin the journey. So if I flip camera, fantastic. So this is an article published in journal, volume 103 of the Antiquaries Journal, which is the peer-reviewed academic journal of the Society of Antiquaries of London, of which I am a fellow. I am, one of my qualifications, I have letters after my name, is FSA, because this is a Royal Chartered Society, the premier society, and membership by election. But so this is a prestigious journal, national journal, the Antiquaries Journal, volume 103, pages 36 to 62, published through Cambridge University Press. I think this is open access, I should say. So I think you can go and read this by following the details. It's called Sutton Hoo, Reimagining the Ship and Chamber. It's by Valerie Fenwick, and the abstract reads as follows. The cemetery at Sutton Hoo in East Suffolk includes tumuli dated to the 6th and 7th centuries AD. The largest contained an intact ship burial. The man commemorated is not identifiable. And why they say man is largely because the grave goods, there's no body, the grave goods are traditionally seen as exclusively masculine. But we'll come back to that. But is often presumed to be Eadwald or Ex Anglorum, AD 599 to 625, that's his reigning sort of period, for the East Angles. He's king of the East Angles, king of the Angles, but the East Angles. Excavation was curtailed by the outbreak of war in 1939. Despite subsequent re-excavation and lengthy research, questions remain. Information dispersed in the definitive publication is correlated and developed. Digital 3D imaging of the ship's iron fastenings are used here to extrapolate curved lines of missing rivets and superimpose them on the burial chamber plan. And the digital roof reconstruction is also presented. Mechanisms of collapse of the objects are deduced from their positioning and damage, revealing space for access to the chamber. A cross-section depicts the calculated height of the deck and known tilt of the ship. Residues of phosphate, Middle Eastern bitumen, tar and tape can cumulatively suggest embalming practices. A temporary coffin and a bed on which possessions were placed are proposed. The most valuable objects relinquished is deduced to be the ship. Fragments of a possible anchor are identified. The suggested identification of an iron stand as a raised light would allow supporting ships to follow. Now that's very matter of fact and not very unpresupposing of that is a kind of descriptive abstract of an older scholar who doesn't want to make anything of themselves. And younger scholars, such as myself and younger than me, tend to be a bit more braggy in their abstract about the implications of the find. But this is really quite exciting. If we believe all this is being argued, this really does transform how we understand the Sutton Hoo ship. Okay, just believe you me, as they say. So the key points of this article, as I've already introduced it, they introduced the excavations in 1939 and the re-excavations from 1965 to 1967. There's a photograph from 1965 of the site with Mound 1 just out of view during the excavations. And this is the excavation of the snug Anglo-Saxon ship burial pit. And there's a lot of detail here which is reanalysing what was published in the 1970s and 80s about the ship. And the first point is about the ship itself. And the first implication and the argument is, and just go back to that image, is that in the publications they missed the grave cut. They completely misunderstood the grave cut. And the argument presented here in a very modest way is this 27-metre long ship had been dragged up and dropped into a 3-metre deep, very carefully tight, snug trench cut to nestle it. And therefore they're completely reinterpreting how the ship was dragged. It wasn't dragged up into a massive gaping opening and then filled in. It was dragged up onto possibly a set of rafters or horizontal timbers, and then they removed them and with ropes dropped gently this 27-metre long ship into the chamber. So that's actually a new interpretation for the movement of the ship from the estuary up the steep hill to the site itself. And I think that's really important. The second really important point to make is that they've done a reanalysis of how the ship looked and how it collapsed, because they were able to identify, you do a digital analysis of the ship. And this is all part of a project to remake the ship, a project being run at the moment by the Riverside Trust from 2016 to reconstruct the ship. And to do that, they were trying to work with the excavation plans and realised they were getting into trouble. And so they've done a three-dimensional model, 3D digital model of the ship. And this has allowed new interpretations to come forward. And the first thing that has been observed is that the whole ship had tilted by 6 degrees off vertical. And that this ship therefore had been dropped into this trench but had subsequently moved, and the interpretation is that this happened after the ship they'd started to build a huge burial mound over the top of it, and that the ship tilted not during an observable process but as the ship was being buried with its chamber intact and the weight of earth was being pushed onto the roof. But there's other things that this reinterpretation of the ship brings up, in the fact that they think now that it was a 28-oared ship, and that it was it'd been carefully, it had a deck with vegetable matter amidships that may have been bedding, and they visualise the ship as possibly looking originally like this, as a rowing ship, although there may have been sail assistance. And in the centre, you'd have a deeper space with bedding, which they found from vegetable material that suggested there was this kind of vegetable matter as a form of bedding for passengers or for animals to be placed in. But of course, they could be moved aside if you wanted to put a sail up. And this is a quite a significant refinement of how we envisaged a ship looked and was rowed and how it could have been contained both animals and people. There's also other details that I won't go into, including evidence that there's a sort of detail. This is a digital reconstruction, and that they built the chamber in a different manner to what's postulated. That the burial chamber itself was made of across the frames numbers 10 to 16 would have been about 2.9 meters high, and would have had a likely turf roof or bracken roof. So they've found that they're making. I mean, this is from inferences from the details of the structure, and this is all changing how we understand not only the ship but the building of the burial chamber within the ship. And it goes on. So they're also able to suggest that there was a platform of fasteners under the ship in which the chamber was dropped down onto. So you have a chamber built, if I can go back up here, with a floor placed across and strutted up to create a space upon which the burial assemblage was rested. And so this is all really additional important details. Then they explore the actual collapse. Let me just come out a bit so you can see. This is the C.W. Phillips plan of the burial chamber with all the objects, right? And then Fenwick is able to actually refine details of how during the decomposition and the collapse of the chamber, the rotting and the collapse of the chamber, the objects moved around, and many of the objects would have actually been suspended at either end. And so this adds further details of how the burial chamber would have operated. And they also make a key further interpretation that there may have been a temporary entrance, rather than the previous idea that the roof was left off and people furnished this burial chamber after the carpenters had built the chamber. People left the roof off and they filled things in. This is actually suggesting this was a hidden chamber, and that an entrance was at the east end and was cut through or opened up to allow the furnishing and provision of the burial chamber. And that's a very different arrangement, and that has real implications for how we understand the funeral and the visibility of all these rich objects. Very few people would have been able to look down onto these objects in one place at one time. Right, so that's all really interesting. I'm going to jump the sequence of the paper because I don't think the paper is organised in the way I would have organised it, because there's two other really important artefacts. So here's details of the likely organisation of how oarsmen may have sat, and then the building of the construction of a deck beam, and then a frame to support that chamber. And then there's artist reconstruction of how the chamber may have looked when completed. So quite a substantial space within the ship, and this preempts their interpretation of the burial coffin, which is different from what has previously been postulated. There are two options for how it looked. That's the temporary entrance at the east end. This is looking to the west end with the shield suspended and the iron standard in the northwest corner. Okay, so this is really a new, refined interpretation. Now I want to jump these discussion of the treatment of the body to talk about two other objects linked to the ship which they found, and this is really amazing. No one had really talked about this. I hadn't seen any discussion of this. They are arguing that they found an anchor within the burial chamber, and that this anchor would have been positioned to the north of the body. If I go out to the burial chamber, hang on, where has it gone? Bear with me while I find the right illustration. Yeah, they're arguing they've got an anchor in the grave from bits of iron. So another major piece of ironwork that previously hadn't been interpreted, they're suggesting could have been in this area to the north of the body, which is pretty cool. The other interpretation is really mind-blowing, right? The iron standard has since 1939 been interpreted as a battle standard, or a tufa, a kind of ceremonial standard of a king. Redwold, if it was Redwold was a Bretwalder, a high king who was very successful in battle. No one defeated him in battle. He kicked everyone's ass. in battle, and that he for a time Bede describes him in the early 8th century, looking back a century, as an overking, a Bretwalder of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So he was East Anglia's king, but he was also an overking. And so there's been an argument that this is like a Roman imperial emperor. This is an adaptation of a Roman imperial standard as represented on coins. This is a kind of basket and structure that would have been carried into battle, and a more practical explanation has been this could have been used to rest your weapons against, your spears and so on. But the spear, the shaft into the ground would make it very difficult to balance and stand up. So it's never been fully convincing, and Fenwick argues we've got an alternative interpretation, inspired by coinage and the Bay of Tapestry. She says this could be what's called a cresset, basically a royal standard, but on the ship. And if you wrap pitch and set fire to it, because it's fully iron, this makes sense as a near waterproof, flammable standard, a cresset for a ship, for a lead ship or a royal ship, to announce arrival, announce departure, to communicate to other ships, and to therefore be a standard of forms, but a maritime standard for the king, and one that was about communication of status and communication of messages. And I think that's a really interesting idea, and because it is a ship, and yet everyone's trying to found landward interpretations, whereas this is actually a maritime interpretation. And there's, from the Bay of Tapestry, a structure on top of one of the ships which has never had a satisfactory interpretation, but in the comparison with this, changes where we're up to in understanding the artefacts. And I think that's a really important point, because if this was a royal standard, why does it have to be all iron? That makes no freaking sense. That's so heavy. You'd want a wooden handle, so you can carry it. So your standard bearer is going to get pretty tired if they're logging that everywhere to the battle, or to the assembly, or to the royal court, or whatever. So this actually makes more sense, because iron, of course, won't melt, and that this is therefore a kind of experimental. They've done experimental archaeology, as you can see there. And experiments show that the flame doesn't catch, it doesn't spread, it's quite safe, or reasonably safe. So I like that idea, it's a very interesting idea. But the real revelation of the paper is not about the ship, the burial process, and these other objects, the possibility of an anchor and a cresset, but the possibility that this burial chamber may have been very different from what we anticipate. And this is really a mind blower for me. But it's quite shocking, because the argument has been there was no body, there's no human remains or animal remains preserved, right, because the soil is so acidic. But phosphate analysis and other traces hint at the presence of a body, right? But the problem is, if this is an elaborate funeral, how do we arrest the body's decomposition for this elaborate funeral to take place? And Fenwick posits the idea that some form of embalming took place, not to the same extent as ancient Egyptian mummification with evisceration, dissection, but some kind of wrapping. And she makes the point, and actually cites me, I forgot I wrote an article about this, that we do have, obviously, I co-authored an article with Sarah Semple, that we actually do have evidence of Christian mummification, embalming practices in Middle Anglo-Saxon England from the late 7th, 8th centuries. They were preserving bodies. And, is there the possibility that Sutton Hoo, we may be looking at this deliberate arresting of decomposition, not by cremation in this case, but embalming? And that's not as ridiculous as it first seems. And so the evidence that is brought in to support this is the cloth tapes. Now, the profusion of textiles, Fenwick argues, has never been fully explained. And there's a whole series of unusual coils of tapes. And she basically argues that these could have been medicinal, and they could have been for applying various treatments to the body. The other thing is the presence of bitumen. With no trace of tar within the lands of the planking, No evidence of surface tarring has survived, but we do have evidence of this tar that's been recently identified as 53 fragments of bitumen of Middle Eastern origin. And this could be argued to be evidence of mummification, says the author. There is evidence in Northern Europe that within Redall's lifetime, the Merovingian elite practiced embalming. The processes were unsophisticated, with oral injections including benzoic acid. They were essentially based on the use of oil and resin-soaked linen strips used with aromatic plants such as thyme, nettles, myrrh and aloes. Embalming knowledge may be assumed to have been widely shared in court circles and trading gifts of exotic materials such as frankincense, myrrh and bitumen by the Byzantine Empire. Remember, this burial had Byzantine silver within it. And she also makes the postulation there could have been a body space with a coffin to the west of the area where the normal coffin is postulated, and that this was possibly a log cut coffin that was interred in the burial space. I'm going the wrong way. I need to find you the burial plan. So 1 second. Yeah. So she's speculating that rather than down here, where there was a coffin is usually speculated to be, that the individual had been buried in a coffin here, and that at their foot they had a bed upon which were laid all these grave goods. Now, it goes without saying this is a bit of a push. This is stretching it, right? But it's a fascinating reinterpretation of the burial arrangement. So rather than a very tall man around here, there's a shorter man of about 5'9", 10", my height. It's not that short for the Anglo-Saxon period, but certainly not, who's in this position right up against the west end of the chamber, and that all these elaborate objects here are on a bed. And it's difficult to prove either way. But I think it's a really interesting idea. So let's step back and let me make a few points about this. So, hello again. So this was always a unique, elaborate chamber burial, which has parallels. The parallels sought for it have always been in Scandinavia. Ship burial of the pre-Viking age in Scandinavia from Vendel, Valsgärde, Tuna, and various other sites long before the Viking ship burials. Right? In Scandinavia from Vendel, Valsgärde, Tuna, and various other sites long before the Viking ship burials. Right? And increasingly shown to have links with Merovingian Francia, the Frankish Empire, and on to Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. And that scholars have, over the last 20 years in particular, really challenged this obsession with seeing Sutton Hoo as a Scandinavian phenomenon, as a Scandinavian, pagan, Swedish-influenced funerary space. Instead, they've tried to see it increasingly as evidence of exposure and influence and interaction with the Merovingian and Byzantine world. And so, taking that further, the paper doesn't adequately put this in context, but this is part of a broader reconfiguring of our understanding of this burial as not one that's antithetical to Christianity, is antithetical to the European Christian world, but is actually a performance of a burial by a small English kingdom on the edges of powerful neighbours who were directly influencing their ritual practices. Yes, there are influences from Scandinavia. Yes, this is unlikely to be a fully Christianised burial practice, but this kind of elite performance is not antithetical to paganism, to Christianity at all. And if the idea that as part of the ritual performance they were mummifying, embalming the body for a crude form of mummification, and of course I know I shouldn't have really used the term mummification because it's such a loaded term, but a form of arresting decay, then it's a really important way of rethinking not only the contacts of the people performing the burial, the long distance contacts, but also how the burial was experienced. Because a lot of the discussion of Sutton Hoo has been that it's a theatre, a poetic performance in public, equivalent to a performance in the late 16th century at the Globe or something like that. And that has inspired Martin Carver to write of it as burial as poetry, and then moved on. And this idea has been picked up by scholars like Anders Andrén and Neil Price for Viking funerals as a public theatre. And it's an idea I've been long critiquing, because while I think that's a very powerful idea, that you're setting the dead out decked with all these objects for everyone to see, I have already argued almost in 2006 that this is only part of the story. Part of the power of these objects is not their display, but their removal from sight, their consignment, their closure, their layered and structured destruction or concealment within the burial. And I think this new understanding of a chamber that had a limited access and limited visibility and a dugout coffin that has very little, there would have been, the body itself wouldn't have been dressed, it would have been embalmed and wrapped, means that this burial process, it would have been much more intimate, much more secretive than people have posited. And therefore the dynamics and the politics of theatre, if applicable, are very different. The materiality, the spatiality of the funeral is changed. And I don't think this paper doesn't go into this at all. It just goes, here we are, here's the new evidence, thank you, good night. But I think there's a lot of implications there. Okay? Then we have the implications for how we do public archaeology for the Anglo-Saxons. Because this is a site that is now 85 years old. Working out my dates, 60, 70, 80, 85 years since this was excavated, and it's still capturing the public imagination. And a lot of this work came from a shipbuilding project to replicate the ship, to build a new version of the ship buried in Mound 1. So this is where there's a feedback loop between the heritage and the experimental archaeology and new research. And also there's lessons here about the dynamic of particular personalities dominating the interpretation of these finds, and now we're seeing new ways of interpreting that evidence coming to the fore. So I think what we're looking at is a shift in how we understand the funeral, how we understand the contacts and the society performing that funeral, and also we're seeing a story that sheds light on the ongoing fascination with the early Anglo-Saxons. And despite a zeal in which some medievalists have attempted to purge the term Anglo-Saxon from our vocabulary and discussion, that these early kingdoms speak really interesting and challenging stories about the birth of nations from kingdoms that challenge our preconceived ideas, and that we should be contending with them rather than running away from these stories. And with the opening of the Ad Gefrin Visitor Centre at Wooler with their fine whiskies, and Historical Han has just been up there to look at that site, and she's done a video about that on TikTok, and with the Sutton Hoo Visitor Centre, this story of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which Sutton Hoo embodies, is still relevant to today, is still pertinent and powerful, and is unfolding and changing. And I think it definitely speaks about the enduring power of this period to capture the imagination. The Dark Ages. I've said it. So that's my initial thoughts. I think there's implication. This paper doesn't go into the implications. The implications of the contacts and influences on the East Anglians in the early 7th century and kingdom formation. The performance of the funeral and its mnemonics and its phenomenology, if you like. And then also for what is heritage today and how do the Anglo-Saxons fit into this heritage. So I think those are the themes that I wanted to end with in this little reflection on a brand new piece of research.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.